I think we're going to begin, and again, I'm going to apologize for the chairs, which should be arriving very shortly. We have two brief things to do this evening before Gil and I get into a presentation on architects in the neighborhood, which I think you'll find most informative. But you may or may not know, we're presenting the Jim Torain. This is the first year we're presenting this award. The Torain Award acknowledges the person or organization that honors the history of our Bloomingdale neighborhood. It's named after Jim Torain, who ensured that the legacy of the old community, with its many talented and accomplished members, who enriched our neighborhood and our history, would not be lost or forgotten. The old community is an African-American neighborhood that existed on West 98th Street and West 99th Street, and it flourished. I'm going to say that again, it flourished. It was an absolutely incredible neighborhood of talent and neighborhood abilities. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. See if you recognize any of these names. And this is not a complete list by any means. And we are so honored to have members of the Torain family here. This is some 60 years, more than 60 years after the community was decimated by urban renewal in 1955. They still organize and get together. Unfortunately, we lost Jim Torain, the guiding spirit of the old community, in December of last year. But many members of his family and the organization are here today. And I'd like to ask them maybe to stand up or raise your hand if anyone wants to say anything. His brother Harold.
Thank you very much. And we're all very proud to be here. But not as a family. We're proud that we came from this neighborhood. And if you came from this neighborhood, you're proud too. This was the most ethnically diverse area in the world for a long time. And we were very proud that we could say, please, sorry, thank you, in at least a dozen languages. It was important to Jim. It was important to every one of us, and I'm sure among this audience, it was very important to you. I didn't know it was the Bloomberg neighborhood. I thought it was just the 98th Street neighborhood. Of course we flourished. Look where we came from. Thanks a lot. And we are really, really proud, and we owe a great deal of thanks for you all for coming today. Thank you very much.
Peter Salwen wrote the 1989 book, Upper West Side Story, A History in God, which continues to be the primary history of Manhattan's Upper West Side. With more than enough attention to the Bloomingdale neighborhood, it's a constant reference source and inspiration to anyone who delights in understanding our past. In the spirit of our efforts to spotlight our local history, Peter began the research for his book for a block association. He was struck by the fact that there wasn't much written previously, and so he embarked upon his colossal effort to create a substantially original work. It's an enduring testament to him and a truly wonderful gift for all of us. The Torain Award is hereby presented to Peter Salwen. Peter, would you come up, please?
Peter is going to say a few words, but I'm embarrassed to say I forgot to bring our actual award. We have a framed certificate.
That's the Upper West Side. I expected no less. Thanks so much. My old friend Dick Shepard, who wrote the About New York column in the New York Times, used to say, out-of-towners make the best New Yorkers. And I think there was a lot of truth there. Technically, I'm a native, born in Manhattan, but I had the good luck, though it didn't really seem that way at the time, to be raised at first in the wilds of darkest New Jersey, and get brought here as a teenager. And I like to think that places me among what E.B. White called the settlers, the people who were born somewhere else and came to New York in quest of something. White said that the settlers are the ones who give New York its passion. They embrace the city with the intense excitement of first love and absorb New York with the fresh eyes of adventure. I got a lot of lessons from writing this book. The chief of them was that I met this lovely librarian while I was researching it, who's now married to me. I also, thanks to this book, had the pleasure of serving on the New York City Book Awards jury for the past 6 years. And each year we would start with a list of at least 150, 200 titles about New York. Poetry books, novels, photo essays, you name it. And I always had a laugh when I compared that to the 70s, when I set out to write up a West Side Story. They didn't much heart New York in those days. They, just about every publisher in town got a look at my proposal, and I soon had a collection of about 30 nearly identical rejection letters. Sounds interesting. I read it, but a whole book about New York? New York neighborhood? Too specialized for our readers. Good luck. So eventually I did have good luck with Abbeville Press. They took the book, and that's probably thanks to John Torain here. Where's John? John had recently published, a great writer on New York. He had recently published Elegant New York with them, and I think that softened them up, and they took my book on New York. They weren't all that keen on it. It took them, they postponed the pub date 3 times. Once I got a call from my editor. He'd been reassigned to a 2-volume picture book on wildflowers by Lady Bird Johnson. And that sold good 18, 20 copies, I'm sure. Anyway, they eventually came out with my book, and so it was born in 1989 after a 12-year gestation period. And I think if the book has had a good shelf life, it's basically because it's a fan letter. Kind of Valentine to the city and the neighborhood and the characters in it. It's not really scholarly work, although I try to get my facts right. If it's got any kind of a thesis or a theme, it's something like, wow, or hey guys, look what I found. And I can't think of a better group to share such a book with than the Bloomingdale group and you folks here tonight. So thank you very much. I cherish this.
All right, ready for some architecture? Gil and I decided as we started compiling our notes that we had way too much to cover, so we've eliminated any building less than 7 stories. Am I right, Gil?
Effectively, yes.
Okay, so let's begin.
Okay. Give me the microphone, thank you. It turns out the other microphone isn't working. We have only one microphone between us. So like those, were those mythical ladies had one tooth between them and had to pass it back and forth? Yeah. We live in a very densely developed city, and our surroundings for our workaday lives are mostly brick and mortar and steel and glass. And so what architects have created is the backdrop of our lives. And what we'd like to talk to you about this evening is the architects who have shaped our neighborhood. And to elaborate a little bit on what Jim just said, because there are so many buildings and so many architects to talk about, in the Bloomingdale area, which is we define as 96 to 110th Street, there are slightly over 1,000 buildings which were designed by an estimated 200 architects. And so to keep to keep this evening's program in some kind of bounds, we're going to focus this evening on the apartment buildings that were created roughly between 1900 and the early 1930s. We hope to do a future program on the earlier buildings, which have another rich subject. The earlier buildings, including the row houses, the townhouses, the mansions, and those small apartment buildings known as flats. But before we get into the apartment houses, we want to talk a little bit about the architects of some of the early prominent buildings that continue to be major landmarks in our areas. And these are the institutional buildings. So, Jim?
So here's Richard Morris Hunt, who's the architect of this building, which we're in. And it's a fun New York City trivia question. How many memorials to architects are there in Manhattan? And the trick answer is 1.5. And here's the one. This is on the corner of 5th Avenue and 71st Street with a sculpture by the great Daniel Chester French. And that's a memorial to Richard Morris Hunt. In a little while, we'll show you the other half memorial. Another institutional building that Gil and I have great respect for, of course, is the New York Cancer Hospital. Charles C. Haight. He was the de facto architect for the Episcopal Diocese, having done so much. And I forgot, let's go back to Richard Morris Hunt. Does anybody know any other buildings that Richard Morris Hunt did? Did like the basin of the Statue of Liberty? Say again?
The Biltmore?
The Biltmore down in Asheville, North Carolina, yep. Did the 5th Avenue facade on the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Much else. A lot of mansions up in Newport.
And he was also the chair of the panel of architects that designed the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And that was that kind of cemented his position as the Dean of American Architects. And that exposition made the Beaux-Arts style kind of the dominant style of architecture for the ensuing 2 decades. And Hunt was the first American architect to be educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
So, we're on to Mr. Haight, Joel C. Haight, who did Trinity School, did General Theological Seminary down in Chelsea on West 20th Street. The old Columbia University campus, much smaller, down on 49th Street between Madison and Park Avenue. And let's move along. Gil just took this photo of the front of the Cancer Hospital. It's been changed a lot. Obviously, we don't even see the tower that was put in behind it. We also don't see the nurses' residence that's on 106th Street that became Jazz on the Park. We don't see the laboratory, which had the world's largest supply of radium, which is down 105th Street there. But anyhow, we do see this wonderful front that Gil took, all that wonderful Belleville stone, and at the top there's a lot of Philadelphia pressed brick. It's just, you can walk around that block endlessly and have a delightful time. Next one is James Brown Lord, who did this building. Does everyone recognize this building on 100th Street? This was the the Bloomingdale branch of the New York Public Library before they opened the new building. But before that, it was part of the free circulating library, which was kind of an independent library that got absorbed into the New York Public Library system. Lord has quite an interesting lineage. He's related to the Brown Brothers, Herman, and a few other families. Yeah, law firm, Lord Day Law, the maritime law firm and whatnot. You know these guys? Yeah. And this is the other half of the monument to an architect in New York City. It's the one to John Merven, Carerre, and that's at Riverside Drive, right entering the park at about 99th Street.
Well, I just want to say something about James Brown Lord. He died very young. After he did that 100th Street Library, which was very much admired at the time, he got the commission to design several of the new branch libraries that Andrew Carnegie was going to give to the New York Public Library. And he set out to do that, but he only finished one before his untimely death at the age of 43. His best-known building, you know the courthouse on the east side of Madison Square with all the statuary on it? That's James Brown Lord.
So, Thomas Hastings, a little bit of trivia. His father was a dean at Union Theological Seminary, but his grandfather wrote the hymn "Rock of Ages." Rock of Ages, cleft for me. He did. Carey and Hastings did this, and Carerre, talking about James Brown Lord dying early. Carerre died relatively early in the sense that the taxi he was in got hit by a streetcar, I think on Madison and 41st Street, so he died a little bit too young. But anyhow, this is their one building, prominent building in the neighborhood. They actually worked on one other building, the Regent Hotel on the northeast corner of 104th Street and Broadway. And they proposed a very large museum type building for the National Academy of Design, which was going to be on 109th and Amsterdam, but it was never ever executed. So we're moving quickly here so we get on to the apartment buildings. St. Michael's Church, the great Robert W. Gibson. He's done a few things around town. He did a collegiate church on Lower West End Avenue at about 77th Street, if you know that building.
That's one of the few he did that was not Episcopal, I believe. He was born in England, and his first, after he came to the States, he won a competition to design the Episcopal Cathedral in Albany, New York. And that set him on a track, and he designed a string of Episcopal churches. And then St. Michael's over here, a very interesting building. It's the third one on the site. St. Michael's Parish dates back to 1807, and among its founders was Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton. And that tower was the tallest building in this neighborhood for many years after it was completed in 1891.
Yeah, and one of the two buildings that had Tiffany windows in the nearby area, it still does. It has 5 Tiffany windows up in the house. The other one was this very room. This room is part of an addition to the Richard Morris Hunt building, the Association for Aged and Respectable Females.
The Association for Aged, Indigent, Respectable, I think Protestant. But anyway, aged, indigent, respectable females in the city of New York.
So these windows in this room here, this was the chapel. They were Tiffany windows at one time. They were thought to be lost, but they were found down in, recovered into a museum down in Winter Park, Florida. So if you ever down there, you can check that out. Another wonderful building, church building also, Henry F. Kilburn's West End Presbyterian Church, thought to be for a short period of time the largest Presbyterian congregation in the whole city. The magnificent use of terracotta here. Kilburn's done a few other things around town. He did the entrance to the Park West Presbyterian Church on 86th and Amsterdam Avenue. He just did the entrance there. And he did the ill-fated Pabst Tower. You probably never heard of that, but it was a hotel that went up in 1899, and it got replaced 3 years later by the Times Tower, which is the building from which they dropped the ball, which over time became the Allied Chemical Building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the area, the name changed to Times Square. That's where we get the name from.
And one of the reasons this building was so large, the original church was just the part you see at the east end, where there's that gable at the east end. And then the rest was created later. And it was made so large because that church was expected to accommodate the children from the Protestant half-orphan asylum, which was an institution that existed at the corner of Manhattan Avenue and I think 104th. That building was there until about 20 years ago. There were about 150 children there, and they were the church was charged with their spiritual guidance.
So, before we talk about James and Leo, I want to say for the record, I still have goosebumps knowing that members of the old community and Jim Torain's relatives are with us tonight. I just think that's absolutely fabulous. So, but now on to James and Leo. They did this magnificent building in 1899. Was it?
Let me just say a few words just to introduce the subject of urban development here. Urban development in this part of Manhattan began really in 1879 with the opening of the 9th Avenue elevated line on what we now call Columbus Avenue. That initial development was mostly east of Broadway mostly for the reason that the blocks west of Broadway, most of them did not yet have sewer or water mains in them. And this initial development consisted almost entirely of row houses with some small apartment houses known as flats, mainly along the avenues. But by 1900, nearly all the blocks west of Broadway had sewer and water lines installed, so they were ripe for development. And in addition, the city's first subway line was under construction. They started building it in 1900, and it was completed in 1904. And this spurred a wave of development, and this time including substantial apartment houses. So, which brings us to this one called the Alimar.
And James and Leo were so successful with this building, they dazzled the developer who hired them to build the Doralton, which is on 71st and Broadway, that landmark building. You've probably seen it. It has, actually has sculptures on the facade of the building. Spectacular building. John F. Kennedy Jr. used to live there. But they also did a lot of nearby buildings on the north side of 105th Street between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive. And they did most of the buildings on Riverside Drive between 105th and 106th Street. And then they also worked on this building.
Well, this building has a peculiar history. This I'm sure you'll recognize. This is the Manhassett on the west side of Broadway between 108th and 109th. It originally had only 8 stories, designed by a man named Joseph Wolfe. It was built from 1899 to 1901. But before it could be occupied, the developer lost the building to foreclosure. The new owners called in James and Leo to expand the building upward, probably to take advantage of a change in the building laws that raised the height limitations on residential buildings. So, over the next 4 years, 1901 to 05, James and Leo added an additional story, gave the building a second cornice, and then topped that with a 2-story mansard. And they were also responsible for the 2 elaborate and beautiful entrance pavilions that they fitted into the light courts facing the side streets. I passed one of those yesterday, and it's really just terrific. They had several other buildings in Bloomingdale. I think I better not recite the other buildings for now. We'll hold them.
So now we're getting into the apartment buildings, and we'll probably run through a whole series of these. And as Gil promised you, we'll have a separate session where we'll look at other buildings of lesser height. mostly earlier period. But here's William Rouse, who later on partnered with a fellow by the name of Goldstone. Rouse and Goldstone worked on the Heinrich Hudson, that really first elegant luxury apartment building on the northeast corner of 110th Street and Riverside Drive. But this building is really spectacular. You have to promise yourself that the next time you're down at 98th Street and Riverside Drive, look to the top there. We're not doing justice to the glazed terracotta at the top there. This is the building that has a plaque on it because Mayor John Perroy Mitchell lived in the building when he was mayor. Some other subtle stuff. You might be able to see the roof line up there, which is reflective of what the whole building does. It's curved. It's curved to Riverside Drive. Wonderful Riverside Drive, which not only curves, but undulates, meaning it goes up and down, gives it that very, very special quality. And then when you marry that to the fact that it's one of the largest stands of elm trees in the United States that's been preserved, and just the wonder of Riverside Park, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the sculptures, we can go on and on. But this building kind of starts off with that wonderful trend.
This building is called the Peter Stuyvesant, and another interesting point about it is that Rouse's client for this was a man named James Lee, whose daughter, to his great dismay, married a man named Bouvier, and whose granddaughter was Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy.
Let's go back to Rouse for just 1 second. Another building that we just didn't, we kind of ran out of space, so to speak, but if you're on the corner of 98th and Broadway, I'm referring to the Boar Shop. It's the southeast corner of 98th and Broadway. Absolutely spectacular building. It's the only building I know of, I could be wrong, it's the only building I know that has a courtyard on Broadway. You kind of know from, let me go in here, the Stuyvesant, just a block or two up, there's some buildings on Riverside Drive that have courtyards right on Riverside Drive. That's almost heresy because it's very valuable property, et cetera, et cetera. But this Rouse building, the Boar Shop on the southeast corner of 98th and Broadway has a courtyard, and yet they handle it very, very well. And the main entrance is on 98th Street. I think the address is 220 West 98th Street. It's absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, Pelham, I think that, the Broadmoor. Okay. George F. Pelham was one of the most prolific architects in the history of the city. Over 43 years, his work ranged from row houses up to elevator apartment buildings. He was born in Canada. His father had designed the Dominion Parliament building in Ottawa. And in 1875, the elder Pelham moved the family to New York, where he opened an architectural practice, working mainly for the City Parks Department. The younger Pelham trained under his father and opened his own office in 1890. More than 200 of his buildings still stand on the Upper West Side alone. There's a whole list of them in Bloomingdale, several on Riverside Drive and on West End. And this one is the Broadmoor at Upper the 2nd and Broadway, which I'm told has over 300 apartments in it.
Neville and Bagge. We pronounce it Bagge or Bagge?
In addition to fighting over the microphone, we have been fighting over the pronunciation of Neville and Bagge. But I'm reconciled to Neville and Bagge. I had been pronouncing it Baggy. Anybody else?
Let's stick with Bagge.
Michael, do you have any opinion on that?
I think they must have done several hundred Manhattan, Brooklyn.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But on the pronunciation, no, okay.
not much is known about these guys. We know their names, right? Yeah, Thomas P. Neville and George Arthur Bagge. They had an office for a while on 125th Street, but they did so much stuff. You're gonna get with many of these apartment buildings. There are nuanced details that you'll get sensitive to. But these guys are pretty easy to figure out. Incidentally, this building is on the southwest corner of 105th and Central Park West. And if you follow Seinfeld real carefully, this is the fictitious home of Elaine Bemis. But I'm going to jump ahead and come back. Here's the characteristic of Neville and Bagge. This is between 99th and 100th on the west side of West End Avenue. And I'm not doing them justice with this. On the 100th Street end, they did 801 West End and they did 817 West End. And up on the top there is that huge, elaborate Art Nouveau feature. And in the early morning, with early morning sunlight, it really stands out. And with that, you can find out, as Michael was saying, many Neville and Bagge buildings, all through the Upper West Side, into Manhattanville, Harlem, even further, a little bit into Washington Heights as well. But let's go back to this favorite building.
That's the Dewey, 850 West End Avenue. And interesting thing about this, it says 1899 there. It's called the Dewey in honor of Admiral George Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay. And if you go there and you look up, there is actually a sculptured head of Admiral Dewey on the facade. There's two of them? I only knew of one. My goodness. Did not know that. See, I learned something. Thank you.
So the next time you're on West End Avenue, and this is at 102nd Street, or 102nd, I think the southeast corner of 102nd Street, look carefully at this building. One of the dance groups used this as a dormitory for years. I forget, not American Ballet Theater, but another one. But anyhow, it's got some really funky detail on it. It's impossible to show. I just tried to blow up this digitized thing to show you where the heads of Dewey are, in case you're interested. But there's some other sea creatures, the likes of which I can't make any kind of sense out of. So, but anyhow, here's the typical Neville and Bagge roof line.
Okay, our next architect is a man named Herman Lee Meader. Had an interesting life. He was born in New Orleans. He attended several different colleges, it says, before he finally earned a degree from Harvard. And he started out in the office of Ernest Flagg, the designer of the Singer Building and the designer of St. Luke's Hospital. And then in the office of Raymond Admiral, who designed that Immigrant Savings Bank on Chambers Street. And both of these guys were known for their skilled use of terracotta and color effects. Meader spent most of his career working for the Astor Estate, which enabled him to live in the penthouse of the old Waldorf Hotel on 33rd Street. He was personally fascinated by Aztec and Mayan architecture, and he made a couple of trips to Mexico and Central America, and then he came back, and this is he has a couple of other buildings in Manhattan. He designed this one, which is characterized by this Mayan architecture with jaguars and skulls and snakes. Buffalo skins, yes. I don't know, were there buffalo down where the Mayans are? Anyway, it's a very interesting building built on this wedge-shaped site. And that lunette, that half-moon window up there is very noticeable. And you can get up close and look at that. It's at the northeast corner of 96th Street and Riverside Drive.
What's the deal with the name of that book?
Oh, yes. Thank you. reminding me. All right. It is one of two notable buildings in our area which are named after a work of literature. I mean, you probably know about Pomander Walk, which is named after a Broadway play. And this building, the Cliff Dwelling, is thought to be named after a novel called The Cliff Dwellers, about a bunch of people living in an apartment building in Chicago.
All right, now we get to a giant, Emery Roth, 825 West End Avenue, and I just searched my notes. There's one really famous person that lived in this building, but we'll come back to it. Roth worked in, Herman Woke, that's right. Herman Woke lived in this building. Emery Roth worked for Richard Morris Hunt in Chicago. And Richard Morris Hunt, as Gil said, was in charge of all the architects there. So when they were building that City of Light, that all too important the 1893 World Exposition based on the anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, which influenced architecture for decades to come. Roth went out there as a draftsman and worked for Richard Morris Hunt in some of his final years, and he was so impressed that Hunt wanted him to work for him back in New York City. But Roth came back to New York City, and he started doing some of his own stuff. He designed this building, but he actually lived in the penthouse of this building on the southeast corner of 101st Street and Broadway. Every so often this is in the news just because of the special part of the apartment. Roth lived in a number of other places. Quick sidebar on Roth. I've noticed in the last few years the phrase, the Central Park skyline. And they're referring to all of the Roth buildings that characterize Central Park West more than any other street in the city, including Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue. And I'm talking about the buildings that you all know, the El Dorado, the San Remo, the Beresford. All of that is Emery Roth work. But we have a fair amount of Emery Roth stuff in our neighborhood. How many buildings did he do, Gil? He did a few hundred, I thought. While Gil might be checking, his sons continued the practice, and it's not much is made of the fact that Emery Roth and Sons did the Pan Am building, for example, which became the modern changed the name, the MetLife building. It used to have a helipad on the roof. And consultants on the Seagram building, and they were brought in to do the Twin Towers. The Japanese architect Yamasuke, who won the design competition, was very renowned, but not big enough to execute a project of that size. So it was Emery Roth and Sons that had done that. Anything else on that?
Well, I wanted to note that, when he started out, he came to the United States from Hungary at the age of 13, and he got this job. He worked, and initially he was hired by Burnham and Root. Daniel Burnham, the man who said, "Make no little plans." And it was while at Burnham and Root that he was assigned to work with Hunt, who was based in New York. Then he comes to New York, and he works for Hunt, but Hunt died a year or two after that. But while working but that was the point where Hunt was designing one of these, I think he was designing the Vanderbilt House, the breakers up in Newport, and also working on that was another well-known architect whose name has slipped my mind, so I'm going to have to look it up. Ogden Codman Jr., yeah. So, and Codman was best known for interiors of luxurious mansions. So here was this guy who was he had been educated working on the magnificent World's Fair and for these two architects who were specialists in designing homes for the very wealthy. But that was a very limited market, and as a Jewish immigrant, he didn't have the social connections which were usually required to get commissions of that kind. And so he wanted to establish himself, and to do that, he found a couple of older architects who were about to retire, but who had a reputation, and he kind of bought them out with the proviso that he could continue to use their names. And so he did that for a couple of years until he'd established himself as an architect of apartment buildings, and then he went out, he resumed a solo practice, although it had really been a solo practice all along. And he designed a string of these early, well-known apartment buildings. Another one was the Belle Claire. That was his.
And the Belle Claire, I apologize for digressing here a little bit. The Belle Claire, which I think most people know is on Broadway in 76 or 77, I think 76, southwest corner. They actually owned a golf course out in Queens, in Bayside, the Belle Claire Golf Course, which got developed into Bayside Hills. My wife Janet, who was here, actually grew up in a house that would have been on the property of the Belle Claire Golf Course. Two other really favorite Roth buildings, and again, I apologize for digressing here. One is there's an old Hungarian synagogue. It's really hurting down on Rivington Street between, I think, Stanton, and maybe even, I forget what the next street over. It's on Rivington, the north side of Rivington. And another one, really obscure, is southwest corner of 39th Street and 8th Avenue. If you're ever there, you'll see a building that looks like it's just about ready to fall down. And that's a very early Emery Roth. But we need to get off of Emery Roth and get to some of our favorite architects in the area. Schwartz and Gross, who did my building, 370 Riverside Drive. Some of the early stuff, like Bretton Court, on West 100th Street, is absolutely fabulous. This may be one of their most renowned buildings. We have, there's not many porte-cocheres in the whole city, but we've got one in the Bloomingdale neighborhood and two in Morningside Heights. Porte-cochere being this thing where you can kind of ride into the front door. This building, of course, sits on the site of Isidore Strauss's house. That's why we have Strauss Park. We did a whole separate historical presentation on that. But anything else on that?
I just want to point out the first one, the Bretton Court. Schwartz and Gross, they met as teenagers as students at the Hebrew Technical Institute, which was a charitably run institution for immigrant boys. It's now the building on Stuyvesant Street. Yeah, I mean that was their building, although it was built after the Schwartz and Gross were there. And Schwartz, I think, started out. He started out as a. We'll skip that. They started out, apprenticing with architects, and then about 1903 they formed this partnership. 1903 was just in time for this massive apartment boom, and so they, over the years, based on building department records, they designed nearly 500 buildings in Manhattan, and they designed in a variety of styles. Of course, it was a big firm with a lot of designers in it. And this Bretton Court is notable because it's one of the rare examples of the Vienna secession style in New York.
If you want to see an even more obscure architectural style, there's another Schwartz and Gross building on 94th and Central Park West, which has the relatively rare Egyptian modern style. If you look up at the roof line, you'll see kind of a curvature that's done in brickwork. It's very interesting. So they've done some nice work there. So, they did 610 West 110th Street. It looks pretty mundane here. I thought I'd show this just so, this is one of Gil's earliest cars on 110th Street there. And you can see some of the surrounding buildings, including on the far right side, 375 Riverside Drive. An Ajello building, we'll get up to that. Schwartz and Gross did 929 West End Avenue, which replaced the Bloomingdale Dutch Reformed Church, which was on that site from about 1907 to about 1915, 13 or 14. Didn't last all that long. That gave the name, we know Strauss Park today. Before it was called Strauss Park, it was called Bloomingdale Square because of the church that was right there. And before that, for a brief period of time, it was called Schuyler Square, named after Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, General Philip Schuyler, according to New York City minutes and council and alderman minutes and whatnot. But this was also the last home of the great Oscar Hammerstein the First, right there. Another great building, they did Holland Court Apartments. This morning I jogged down to see this building again, and I was dazzled by it. It's quite a building.
Well, most of the architects we've mentioned designed in traditional styles that were popular in their era. Variants of Romanesque, Beaux-Arts, or Renaissance, adapted to the scale and economics of apartment houses. The work of Harvey Wiley Corbett marked a significant change. He was one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. He graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts, and he worked first for Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Custom House, and also the architect of the Woolworth building. So he was working for this guy, designing in this flamboyant style of the Renaissance and then this skyscraper Gothic. But, and Gilbert, by the way, had himself trained with Richard Morris Hunt. So you see the continuity here. Although educated in the Beaux-Arts tradition, Corbett made his mark by creating sleek skyscrapers within the complex setback requirements of New York's 1916 zoning law. And the first one that he did that with was the building on 42nd Street known as the Bush Tower. And this kind of made his reputation. And it was much admired. He wrote articles. He wrote various professional magazines with illustrations by a man by the name of Hugh Ferris. That name may ring a bell with some of you, a wonderful architectural illustrator. And this influenced the architectural profession as well as popular culture, including movies and comic strips. With a third partner and his protege, Wallace Harrison, Corbett was the principal designer of the master apartments at 310 Riverside Drive. And later on, he was one of the designers of Rockefeller Center, and he was chairman of the architecture committee of the 1939 New York World's Fair. So he was a real powerhouse. And by the way, his pupil, Harrison, his third partner in the firm of Helmley, Corbett, and Harrison. Harrison was later the chief architect of UN headquarters, head of the architecture committee for Lincoln Center, and the designer of the present Metropolitan Opera House. But there's an interesting sidelight to Corbett's background.
Should we say it? He was actually a felon. He got convicted in an early obscure case in New Jersey. Because he was a felon, he could never serve on a jury and various other things, but he certainly lived beyond that. So we won't go into that. You can see all the setbacks here. This then became the tallest building in our neighborhood. The only building taller than this in the larger neighborhood for many, many years was Riverside Church, 392 feet high. But this is up around 270 feet high. which makes it almost twice as high as the approximate roof line of the 15-story buildings all along Riverside Drive and Riverside Drive and much of Broadway also.
Yeah, I could note here that the reason why we refer to the 1916 building law. The 1916, most of the buildings we see along Riverside Drive and West End Avenue were built before, many of them were built before the 1916 zoning law, and they were also governed by a separate set of laws for residential buildings that limited the height of residential buildings to 150 feet. However, the master apartments was built as an apartment hotel, which took it out of the residential category, made it, as far as the regulations were concerned, a commercial building. They weren't governed by that. And it was a few years before the laws were kind of balanced so that residential buildings could go somewhat higher, and that is why the building next door to the master, 315 Riverside Drive, was able to go a little higher. That was built in 1931, just after the law was changed to allow higher residential buildings.
And Sugarman and Berger also did, what am I doing? Yeah. Also did, yeah, we're going to do the Parisville. They also did 245 West 107th Street. I think so. Yeah, am I wrong? No. I know, here's a tidbit. I don't want to go back to Neville and Bagge, but Neville was born, Neville and Bagge designed the Manchester. Everybody know the Manchester, northeast corner of 108th and Broadway, the Manchester Diner? Yeah. And you learn something new every day, Bill. And where was Manchester born? I mean, where was Neville born? He was born in Manchester, England. Is there something there or not? We definitely have to check that out. All right. The Paris Hotel. You want to speak to the Paris Hotel?
Well, Sugarman and Berger were, they're not much heard of today, but they were very prominent hotel and apartment house architects in the 1920s and 30s. And they partnered with Elmley, Corbett, and Harrison on the master apartments. And we have to assume that Corbett was the guy responsible for the exterior massing, because that was his strong point. Whereas Sugarman and Berger were probably responsible for the interior layouts, because they were hotel experts. Their best-known building is the Hotel New Yorker down at 34th Street and 8th Avenue, which at one time was the tallest hotel in the world, or the biggest in the world. Anyway, spectacular in its time. And they designed on their own the Art Deco Paris Hotel at 752 West End, that's at 97.
I'm going to put Gil on the spot. Gil, who died in the Hotel New Yorker?
Nikola Tesla.
Oh, very good. Nice stone. Okay. Oh, in Paris. This was their first building in our neighborhood. They didn't do a whole lot, but there's a wonderful book about them by Anise Alt, which kind of covers all of their stuff. This is one of those buildings that may look a little bit plain. Many of us remember years ago when Manufacturers Hanover was at the street level there. Now it's a CVS, but this is one of those buildings, and a few of them at certain junctures of Broadway, where Broadway kind of turns slightly. So if you happen to have an apartment at the top of this building, you have absolutely spectacular views looking right down Broadway. It's really quite special. They did 444 Central Park West. They did 315 Riverside Drive, and I was on a little mini tour that Tony Robbins gave, Tony with the Art Deco Society, and boy, he waxed eloquently just on this very corner there with that kind of Art Deco slash Art Deco type motif on top of the plinth there, which kind of, the aesthetic look at the bottom of the building. Yeah, look at all the, Neil's just reminding me, I don't take it for granted, but the magnificent use of bricks there. There's such incredible variety, and it's creating the kind of buzz of the height of the building also, just the way those bricks in the middle are arranged. Just absolutely fabulous. And then, of course, they did the Metro Theater. So, big mystery here, though. I haven't gotten a straight answer on this yet from anywhere. This sounds like the type of thing that John Turnock would know the answer to. The rondelle in the middle there, that round kind of glazed mosaic. The landmarks designation report doesn't give it any attribution. And I wonder if it was done by the great Hildreth Meader, who did the rondelles on Radio City Music Hall. I've actually looked at them side by side, and boy, they're awfully close, but that's not good enough. So this is still a mystery as to whether the great Hildreth Meader did that or not.
That building, that theater building has been empty for a long time.
Yes.
Suppose they sold the air rights to the building next door, and shut that.
Oh, yeah. The air rights were sold off that building, yeah.
It's undeveloped. Yeah.
Right now, it's just a concrete box.
So, Rosario Candela, he's from Sicily, as is the great Gaetan Ajello, who we're going to get up to. He's just 2 architects away. Candela studied under him. And Candela now has the distinction, if you're roaming around the city and you've got some money to spend for a high-priced apartment building, the brokers are going to brag about being able to show you a Candela apartment or a Candela building. And used to be some other buildings before that, but Candela, he famously did, amongst other things, did so many things in the, did a bunch of things in our neighborhood, but especially the 5th Avenue and Park Avenue corridors. He did the 740 Park Avenue, which was the John D. Rockefeller Jr. apartment, 20,000-foot apartment, thought to be the largest apartment in the whole city. The only one that came close to that was Huguette Clark's apartment, which was thought to be about 15,000 square feet at 907 5th Avenue. She's the woman who died back in 2011 or 12, the daughter of Senator William Clark, copper fortune, and senator from Montana and all of that. But we have a bunch of Candelas in our neighborhood. So 300 West 108th Street is a Candela building. 800 West End Avenue is a Candela building. And 280 and 285 Riverside Drive are Candela buildings. In fact, the one on the corner there sits on the site, if I remember correctly, Peter Dolger Mansion. We're at 100th Street. 100th and Riverside Drive, I think. Yeah, right across from the Fireman's Memorial. Yeah.
In that area, I'm not sure where it's
I live in a Schwartz and Gross building today, but I previously lived in a Candela building on West 67th Street. And now, talk about George and Edward Blum. Well, let me, do I have your notes? Okay. George and Edward Blum, if you want to see something special, go to this building, 241 West 108th Street. The devil's in the details. The cornice at the roof level has been changed a little bit, but the Blums were not big in classical cornices, overhanging cornices. But you can see from that image on the right side that it's really kind of an unconventional entrance to the building. They do everything simple and elegant. Here too, the brickwork is just absolutely spectacular. but you'll see it more dramatically on this building. How do you pronounce it? Ajello? 838 West End Avenue, which for years and years and years was kind of dirty, and then when it got cleaned up, it really, really shined. You could see all that wonderful terracotta. It's not overdone, it actually adds a certain interesting texture. This may remind you of probably their signature building, and constantly turn over. People are moving on to other cities or going on tour or whatever, so there's all of that. In the lobby, there's ruby tile, which is kind of special. This has incredible verticality to it. You can see the sight lines just take it right up to the top. Gil had an interesting point. At night, you kind of up to the entrance, right?
Yeah, if you get a chance, if you walk past the entrance, which is on the side street, the ironwork there is just wonderful, and when it's backlit at night, it's just beautiful to see. This according to, I believe it was Christopher Gray, said that this was the earliest Manhattan apartment building done in white brick.
I liken this style to whatever they used on the old Yankee Stadium, those outfield, the imagery behind the outfields with that kind of white brick and or terracotta. But anyhow, we're proud to have them in our neighborhood. They've done some other things around town. They did the Rockwell, I think, 111th and Broadway. Well, whole list. There's an excellent book on the Blum Brothers by Andrew Dolkart from Columbia University, so if you want to go further with that. And we appreciate your attention to all of this detail because we're coming down to our final architect here, the great Gaetan Ajello. And before we talk about him, in the upper right-hand corner there, that shield, what's the architectural term for that? Cartouche, thank you. I'm trying to remember that all day. You could have a field day in our neighborhood discovering cartouches. This morning when I ran down to see some of the buildings, my early morning jog, I noticed an AP in a cartouche. And I assume that referred, and that was the Candela building, and I assume that refers to Anthony Campagna, who Gil actually met in person, right?
Yeah, I met him in person in, well, it's been about 1965, 66. He was one of the most important builders of the mid-20th century, and he was a paternal brother-in-law. It was a very big family. There were 6 brothers, and there were a number of sisters, and a number of the sisters married guys who became builders as well. And among them, they housed a lot of people.
So here's the Paterno story in 45 seconds or less. The father Paterno is building a building on 113th Street, just west of Amsterdam Avenue, and he dies. He can't complete the building because he died. One of his sons, Joseph Paterno, that's the JP we see up there, completes the building, but he finished medical school, but never practiced medicine. And so he finished his father's building, and he discovered he can do that very, very well. And so the most common initials you'll see on many of these cartouches, but not all of them, you'll see JP for Joseph Paterno. He famously funded Casa Italiana on Columbia's campus. But there's also another cartouche that has RC, Rosario Candela, and there's a bunch of others. So keep your eyes open for those cartouches. And in fact, between 102nd and 105th Street, there's like about 10 of them. They're always above the entrances to the buildings. So, what Gaetan Ajello did this building, 905 West End Avenue. This is what Gaetan Ajello looked like. He always signs his buildings. I took this picture with my cell phone, and I'm not too technically adept. I showed here 2 places in our neighborhood where he lived. He lived at 415 Central Park West, so did a lot of other famous people like Lorenz Hart, a whole bunch of people, Yip Harburg. But he also lived at 315 West 106th Street. Around 1940, he disappears off the face of the earth. Oh, it was earlier, 30s?
Okay, so he came from Sicily. He was educated in Sicily as an architect and engineer. Came over after a few years, was working for the Paterno brothers, and he did over the next 16 years. He designed about a dozen buildings for them, and 4 of them, by the way, are clustered around the intersection of 104th Street and West End Avenue, but there are quite a few others. And he had this very distinctive style with large window openings and paired or tripled windows and stone or metal balconets. During World War I, he took a hiatus, building had shut down for the war. He took a hiatus and went to work for an aircraft company in New Jersey. And I guess when he came back, he was restless. He worked a few more years, and then about 1925, when he was 42 years old, he suddenly stopped designing buildings. And after a few years, he seemed to have vanished. Years later, Christopher Gray, the great architecture writer for the New York Times, was doing his master's thesis on Ajello, and assuming that the old man was long gone, he was tracking down relatives and found Ajello living with his sister on the Upper East Side. In 1977, he had devoted all those intervening years, he had devoted to developing and promoting a variety of inventions related to aviation, railroads, shoe machinery, mostly with very little success. And Ajello died in 1983 at the age of 100.
Yeah, I was going to mention, he only did one commercial thing, and it's still with us at Landmark just 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. On the southeast corner of 135th Street and Broadway, it's the Claremont Theater. But if you're too lazy to walk up there, you can YouTube it. There's actually a 1914 YouTube of Gaetan Ajello's Claremont Theater, and it's very distinctive style-wise, with people coming out of presumably a silent movie. So it's worth looking for. He did 895 West End Avenue. I showed the image on the right just to, again, emphasize some of the height features. He did 360 Riverside Drive. The Rutherford, Gil and I could talk for about 6 hours on the whole Rutherford experience. Notice it's spelled F-U-R-D, not F-O-R-D, but we'll save that for another time. And here's a favorite building of mine. I'm kind of springing this on Gil. He hasn't seen this. I just forgot that I had it. This is right down the block from me, 227 West 109th Street. It fits in the middle of the block like it doesn't belong. And what's interesting about it is, first of all, it's got a lot of those cartouches with P on it, not JP, but P for Paterno. And there's a bunch of them below a lot of the windows, more than 10 for sure. And notice the awnings on all the windows, not that uncommon. A lot of early images of buildings, especially in places like the Grand Concourse and whatnot, often enough have awnings like that, which was nothing other than like ventilation in lieu of air conditioning, which hadn't arrived yet. And we're going to end it now with your thanks for all that attention with one of his really great buildings. This is on 105th Street and Broadway. You could even see his signature on the lower right-hand part of the building on the Broadway side. This is the Overdene, one of his most masterful works.
Oh yeah. This is one of those that was not done for the Paternos. And if you look above the entrance, you'll see a very complex set of initials And it stands for a client, I think was T.J. McLaughlin Company there.
So, we thank you ever so much. Here's a few names to remember before you go to sleep tonight. Before you leave, we have two little gifts here. This may be more symbolic than anything else, but Gil and I would like to give this to the Torain family. Could you bring that over to them? And then Peter Salwen. Peter Salwen, he's got some of his books in the back if you want to get an autograph. But Peter, would you believe it? I actually have your award up here. Come up and we'll take a quick picture maybe. And while we're arranging for the picture, any questions for Gil? Yes. She just mentioned, reminded us there's an exhibit on Rosario Candela at the Museum of the City of New York, which is fabulous. Yeah.
A few more days, I think. Yeah, I think it ends before the end of this month.
Any other questions for Gil? Yes. The Hudson View Gardens, which
Also, if you look online, you can tell Chris Gray's columns to tell you the rather affecting story of Gaetan Ajello's long life.
You missed that, but that's Bloomingdale. Because
Schwartz is the ladies' room, and then Schwartz over
good.
Ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. The guy in the back has to smile though. Guy in the back has to smile. With Peter, come on.
No, I'm
you in, and I know I don't want to be it either.
What, the history group?